Over the last few years, something interesting has been happening, and most people haven't really noticed it yet, but quietly and steadily, more Americans, especially those nearing retirement or already living on a fixed income, have started looking beyond the United States, not because they dislike where they came from, not because they're chasing luxury, but because the life they expected in retirement is starting to feel harder to maintain. And for many, the numbers simply don't add up the way they once did. For decades, the plan felt straightforward: work hard, save what you can, pay down your debts, and eventually retire into a slower, more comfortable life, one where you no longer had to worry about money every day, where your income covered your needs, and where retirement finally felt like a reward for all the years you spent working. But for many Americans today, that vision is slowly becoming harder to reach. As the cost of living continues to rise, housing becomes more expensive, healthcare costs grow, and fixed incomes stretch thinner each year. And so quietly, without much attention, more Americans have started asking themselves a simple question: what if there's another way to live? What if retirement doesn't have to feel stressful? What if there's somewhere else where their money lasts longer, where life moves at a slower pace, and where living comfortably is still possible? For many, that question eventually leads to places like the Philippines. And while every story is different, many of them begin in a similar way. John was 67 years old when he first started thinking about his future differently, and like many Americans, he had worked most of his life, spending decades in construction, long days, early mornings, physical work that gradually wore him down. But he stayed consistent, saved what he could, paid off debts, and always assumed that when retirement finally came, life would slow down and become simpler, not luxurious, but comfortable enough to enjoy. When he finally retired, his income came from Social Security and a small pension, and together it added up to about $2,200 a month, which he knew wasn't a large amount, but he believed it would be enough for a modest life, one where he could afford rent, groceries, and occasional small pleasures without constantly worrying about money. But over time, things started changing. His rent gradually increased, eventually reaching $1,400 a month. Utilities began climbing. Groceries felt more expensive every time he visited the store. Gas prices fluctuated, and even smaller expenses like insurance, phone bills, and everyday necessities slowly added up until he realized that most of his monthly income was already spoken for before the month even began. By the time everything was paid, there wasn't much left, and some months there was nothing left at all, which meant he wasn't saving, and in some cases, he was slowly dipping into the money he had set aside for emergencies, something he never expected to do so early in retirement. It wasn't the retirement he imagined, and instead of feeling relaxed and comfortable, he felt cautious, cutting back on small things, driving less, avoiding restaurants, skipping purchases he once didn't think twice about, and slowly realizing that retirement felt less like freedom and more like managing a tight budget. And that's when he started noticing something. More and more people were talking about leaving the United States. Not because they hated it, and not because they were looking for luxury, but because they were searching for something simple, a place where their retirement income actually worked. At first, John was just curious, watching videos, reading comments, and learning about people who had moved overseas and were living comfortably on less money than he was spending. And what caught his attention wasn't wealth or luxury, but the idea of living without constant financial stress. One place kept appearing in those stories: the Philippines. Warm weather, friendly people, English widely spoken, and a lower cost of living that seemed to make retirement more manageable. So he started doing the math. He looked at apartments, simple ones, nothing fancy, and saw rentals ranging from $300 to $600 a month, which immediately caught his attention because it was far less than what he was paying in the United States. And when he looked further into groceries, transportation, utilities, and healthcare, he noticed something surprising. His $2,200 monthly income suddenly looked far more workable. For the first time in years, the numbers didn't feel tight. They felt possible. And John wasn't alone. More Americans, particularly retirees, have started exploring the same idea, not because they're chasing luxury, but because they're searching for stability, and in many cases, simply trying to make their retirement last longer. Housing is often the biggest factor, because in many parts of the United States, rent can easily reach $1,500 or $2,000 per month, leaving very little for everything else, while in parts of the Philippines, modest housing can still be found for a few $100s, which alone can dramatically change someone's budget. Healthcare is another reason many retirees consider moving, because even with Medicare, out-of-pocket expenses, prescriptions, and unexpected medical costs can add up quickly, while in the Philippines, many routine medical services are significantly more affordable, and for retirees, that difference can offer peace of mind. Then there's lifestyle. Life tends to move slower, with less pressure, fewer long commutes, and a simpler pace that many retirees find appealing. And for people who spent decades working long hours, that slower pace can make retirement feel more enjoyable. But for many Americans, the decision isn't just about saving money, it's about stretching time, because when someone retires, their savings and income represent more than money. They represent how long their retirement can last, and when someone moves somewhere, their income stretches further, they gain something valuable, more years of comfort. Of course, moving overseas isn't perfect, and there are challenges, adjusting to a new culture, being far from family, learning how things work, and dealing with unexpected expenses, but for some retirees, the trade-off makes sense. John spent several months researching, watching videos, reading stories, and slowly realizing that the retirement he imagined might still be possible, just not where he originally planned. Eventually, he made a decision, sold some belongings, packed what he needed, and booked a one-way ticket, not permanently, but just to try. The first few months were an adjustment, learning a new environment, getting used to a different pace of life, and figuring out everyday routines, but something surprised him. He wasn't stressed about money anymore. He could go out occasionally. He wasn't watching every dollar. And for the first time in years, retirement actually felt comfortable. And stories like John's are becoming more common. More Americans quietly exploring life outside the United States, looking for something simpler, more affordable, and more sustainable. Because after working for decades, retirement shouldn't feel like survival. It should feel like living. And for some Americans, they're finding that life somewhere else. In places like the Philippines. And while John's story isn't the same as everyone else's, the reason behind his decision is becoming more common. Because for many Americans, retirement today looks very different than it did 20 or 30 years ago. And while some people are still able to retire comfortably in the United States, others are finding that their savings simply don't stretch as far as they once expected, especially as housing costs continue to rise, healthcare becomes more unpredictable, and everyday living expenses slowly increase year after year. For some, the change happens gradually, and they don't notice it at first, but over time, the budget becomes tighter, the margin for unexpected expenses gets smaller, and retirement begins to feel less secure than they imagined. And that's when many people begin doing something similar to what John did. They start looking at alternatives. Not necessarily planning to move right away, but simply exploring the idea of what life might look like somewhere else. Some begin researching online. Others watch videos or read stories from people who have already made the move. And slowly, the idea that once felt unrealistic starts to feel possible. But not everyone follows the same path, because for some Americans, the decision to leave doesn't happen slowly. Sometimes it happens all at once. But not everyone follows the same path, because while John spent months carefully researching and gradually warming up to the idea, for some Americans, the decision to leave happens much faster, often triggered by a sudden change in their financial situation, an unexpected expense, or a realization that their retirement may not last as long as they originally planned. Mark was 64 years old when he started thinking about leaving the United States, and unlike John, who eased into the idea slowly, Mark found himself facing the decision much sooner than expected, because after spending most of his life working in a warehouse job, he had always assumed that between Social Security and his savings, retirement would be manageable. But a few years before he planned to retire, a health issue forced him to cut back on work earlier than expected, which meant fewer years contributing to Social Security and less time to build savings. And by the time he officially retired, his monthly income came out to just under $1,900 a month. At first, he believed he could make it work, because like many retirees, he wasn't trying to live extravagantly. He simply wanted a modest apartment, groceries, and enough flexibility to enjoy small things without constantly worrying about money. But as the months passed, he realized that even with careful budgeting, his expenses were adding up quickly, with rent alone costing over $1,000, utilities adding another couple hundred, groceries steadily increasing, and unexpected costs appearing, often enough that he found himself dipping into his savings more frequently than he expected. It didn't take long for Mark to realize that if he stayed where he was, his savings wouldn't last very long, and that realization created a kind of pressure that many retirees quietly experience, because retirement isn't just about monthly income. It's about how long that income and savings will last, and when someone begins to worry about running out of money, the future suddenly feels less certain. Mark first heard about living overseas from a friend who had traveled to Southeast Asia years earlier, and at first, he didn't take the idea seriously, because moving to another country felt like something adventurous people did, not something he imagined for himself. But the idea stayed in the back of his mind, and eventually, curiosity led him to start researching, looking at costs, watching videos, and reading stories from retirees who had already made the move, and like many others, he kept seeing the Philippines mentioned again and again. He read about affordable housing, lower daily expenses, English widely spoken, and friendly communities, and slowly, the idea that once felt intimidating started to feel more realistic, because he wasn't chasing luxury, he was simply searching for stability, somewhere his $1,900 a month would stretch further and provide a more comfortable lifestyle. After several months of research, Mark decided to take a short trip, not with the intention of moving permanently, but simply to experience what life might be like. So he booked a ticket, packed light, and told himself he would stay for a few weeks. And when he arrived, everything felt unfamiliar at first, from the streets to the pace of life. But something surprised him, because he noticed he wasn't worried about money the same way he had been back home. Meals were affordable, transportation was inexpensive, and when he began looking at housing options, he realized that the same monthly income that felt tight in the United States suddenly felt workable. And for the first time in years, he started imagining what life might look like if he stayed longer. By the end of his trip, Mark realized something important. Because not only did he feel less stressed about money, he also noticed that his daily life felt simpler, slower, and more manageable. And instead of rushing through each day, he found himself enjoying small routines, something he hadn't experienced in years, and when it came time to leave, he hesitated. So instead of flying back right away, he extended his stay, and then extended again, and over time, what started as a short visit gradually turned into something more permanent. And like John, Mark found himself living a retirement that felt more comfortable than what he had imagined back in the United States. Stories like Mark's are becoming more common, not because everyone is leaving, but because enough people are exploring the idea that it's becoming noticeable, as retirees begin comparing costs, lifestyle, and long-term sustainability. And for some, the idea of living overseas starts to make sense in ways they never expected. But moving overseas isn't just about saving money, because for many Americans, it's also about lifestyle, with a slower pace of life, warmer weather, and the ability to enjoy daily routines without constant financial pressure, all of which can make retirement feel more relaxed and manageable. There are also practical considerations that make places like the Philippines appealing, including English being widely spoken, established expat communities, relatively affordable living in many areas, and healthcare options that are often more accessible for routine care, all of which contribute to why retirees begin considering these destinations more seriously. At the same time, it's important to understand that moving overseas isn't perfect, because there are adjustments involved, cultural differences, learning how things work, being far from family, and dealing with unexpected challenges, which is why many retirees choose to visit first, taking time to experience daily life before making long-term decisions. Still, the trend continues, with more Americans quietly exploring life outside the United States, looking for ways to stretch their retirement, reduce financial stress, and create a lifestyle that feels comfortable and sustainable. And for some, they find that comfort in places they never expected. Because after working for decades, retirement shouldn't feel uncertain, it should feel comfortable. And for some Americans, that comfort is becoming easier to find somewhere else.